Hello, it's AL-BINO again. So, things are looking encouraging for the election. Let's hope they pan out. I'm just really concerned about what's going to happen between election day and inauguration, because I think things are going to get a little hairy. Yeah, there might be some street riots from some leftists, but I'm more worried about what's going to happen officially in Washington, D.C. That representative from Maryland, in his threat that they're going to go to Civil War posture and not certify the election on January 6th of 2025 and all this other stuff, or they might pull the whole, or part of me is afraid that they might pull the whole, well, technically you won the election in 2020, we just realized this now, so therefore it's been a whole term even though you haven't been in the White House, but technically you should have been president, so they just might. So, I don't think if Trump wins the election, that shenanigans will happen. But I'm less concerned about them being on the civilian level, other than a few protests here and there. I'm more concerned about what's going to happen in D.C. and what the deep state's going to do. Because what we've learned is that the left always telegraphs what they're going to do, and half the time it's through projections. So, say, for example, if they say somebody is like the guy with the funny mustache, or somebody's like the Russian guy who had the mustache, or like the Chinese guy that starved to death 100 million of his own people, or the Cambodian guy that abused people, then if they say that the opposite candidate is going to be that person, that's them projecting what they are on that other person, and that's also them telegraphing their next punch. So if Harris says that Trump is a Mussolini, or the funny mustache guy, or some type of a dictator, that means that she is projecting that onto him, but she's also telegraphing to us what she plans to be. That's what we've learned, right? And we know from other dictators like Vladimir Putin that'll have elections, or Saddam Hussein, that'll have elections to where they really didn't win the election, but officially they got 90% of the vote, right? To the outside world, and then that dictator's reinstalled again. Just to say that the left won't try that, right? Or the latest one now is that they're saying that Trump is going to use the military to go after his political opponents, when we know for certain that that's something that the left is considering doing. Got to use the BINO mind. Got to use the mind and think behind the scenes and read between the margins. So Matilda and I, we make 6 figures combined. There's property, nobody pays a mortgage. I pay rent on an apartment in the town that I'm working in. But combined with my 2 incomes, her business and her income, we do very well. Very well. We don't have near as many bills as other people do. I got this truck payment, but we're going to try and buy her a car in cash, right? So we're okay. We are what 6 years ago would be considered upper middle class as far as income is concerned. And even though financially we're okay, it's still tight for us. So I can't imagine a family earning $70,000 how they're getting by in this Biden economy. I can't fathom it. When I was living in Albuquerque, me by myself, earning $70,000, I was, or $80,000, or even $90,000. When I was living in Albuquerque by myself and earning that much, like 5 years ago, that would be considered, really good income. I'm an above average income earner. I'm earning more than that now, way more than that. But down there by myself, when I was just below or bumping up against six figures, I was struggling. So I cannot possibly imagine a family with two people working, making $70,000 or less. And I had roommates in Albuquerque too. I can't imagine. Wow. Rudyard Lynch with What a Fault Hissed. Sometimes his videos go a little bit wonky on some things that are, let's say, different. But I rewatched a video today that he made about a year ago that talks about the boomers and their economy when they were middle-aged and young adults versus Gen X, millennials, and now Zoomers in the economy that we're in now, right? And his analogy is the Simpsons. And art is based in reality. Good art is based in reality. We know that, right? So his analogy is that Homer Simpson was a blue-collar, lower middle class guy. He says blue-collar, lower middle class loser, who in the 1980s had a single income. His wife stayed at home. They had a 2-story house, and they still were able to take vacations with 2 kids. Homer Simpson in the 1980s and early 90s, right? His analogy again. Lower middle class, blue collar. He says blue collar loser, but blue collar, lower middle class guy was paying a mortgage on a 2-story house. His wife, Marge, stayed at home, raised 2 kids, and they still took vacations. That was a popular cartoon in the 80s and 90s. Still is today, but it was built on that archetype. If you looked at the Huxtables and the Cosby Show, you had a doctor and I believe a lawyer, so they were both upper middle income earners. And they lived in a nice house. A very nice house. So they were obviously living above the crust today. Those same two people today, in today's housing market, in today's economy, would struggle to buy a median-priced 3-bedroom house in any one of the top 50 metropolitan areas in the United States. So I want to say Green Bay, Wisconsin, and larger. What happened? The baby boomers. Mr. Lynch also, in another one of his videos, actually no, it was in the same video about the baby boomers, and I'm going to go off of him today, because, or at least reference him a little bit, because at least in this presentation, although it wasn't completely accurate, I would say he's probably about 85% accurate on this, maybe 90% accurate. He said the boomers dodged the Vietnam War, which technically was the same type of conflict as the Korean War. It was in the same way. Well, they were both undeclared wars. We've never formally declared war on North Korea or the Chinese, for that matter. But by treaty, we were allied to South Vietnam, and by treaty, we were also allied to South Korea. So when the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel in 1950 and made war on South Korea, by treaty, we were automatically in a state of war. So people say, well, that was an undeclared war. Well, it was pre-declared, because by treaty with South Korea and Japan following World War II, if those countries were attacked, then we would automatically go to their defense. So it was declared by treaty previous to the actual war. Here's an interesting fact. The end of hostilities in the Korean War was an armistice. Who were the belligerents in the Korean War? The United States and South Korea versus North Korea and the Chinese. And we are in an armistice, meaning a cessation of hostilities, but not a cessation of a state of war between the two Koreas, and by extension their allies. So technically, legally, we are still in a state of war against North Korea and China. We're just not shooting at each other right now. I'll let you guys figure that out on the flip side too. So, even though the Gulf of Tonkin could be considered a suspect premise upon our entry into hostilities or mass hostilities in South Vietnam in 1964 and 1965, by treaty with the South Vietnamese, starting in 1954, under the Eisenhower administration, the minute the North Vietnamese began to make war against the South Vietnamese, by treaty, that war was declared prior to. Does that make sense? So, in actuality, the Vietnam War, by treaty, was in fact a justified war. The same as the Korean War. So these boomers, by avoiding, and most of them, thank you, the ones that did serve, most of them that dodged the conflict, that was by treaty a declared war, because hostilities were declared by making the treaty with South Vietnam to protect them should they go into war. That was a declared war by treaty. Just like if during the Cold War, or even now, the Russians were to attack, we'll use one of the original NATO countries, not the ones that were added after 1991. If Russia was to attack France, or what used to be West Germany, the western two-thirds of Germany, that would be an automatic war by treaty with NATO, or with our Canamex agreement that Donald Trump made, the treaty he made with Mexico. If Guatemala were to declare war on Mexico because we now have a treaty with Mexico, we'd automatically be at war with Guatemala. We wouldn't have to go declaring. It would just be automatic. That's how treaties work. It's extra constitutional, but it's not, because in the Constitution it says that treaties, once approved by 2/3 of the Senate, are binding law. So that means that war is previously declared in the event that it happens. So Vietnam was not an illegitimate war, therefore all of those who dodged the draft in Vietnam were traitors, because that war was already declared when we made a treaty with South Vietnam in 1954. And what's the North? I'm sorry, 1954, 55. It was right after the French left and the South Vietnamese became independent. We made a treaty with that government, and then once the North started making war against them, by virtue of that treaty, that was already a state of war between us and that aggressor, which would be the North Vietnamese. Same thing in Korea. Same thing with NATO. So, these boomers duck war, a legitimate war, the one of their generation when they were young, the war that Gen X and the older millennials got to play in. Once they were in control in DC, they completely fucked up and lost for us, because in 2008, when Barack Obama was elected, we were almost done in Iraq, and we were almost done in Afghanistan. Almost done. Both of those conflicts in the fall of 2008 were almost completed. But somehow, after Barack Obama was elected, we lost Iraq in 2013. And then Afghanistan drug on for 2 more administrations. And then we finally lost Afghanistan in a glorious fashion under boomer leadership at great national embarrassment in 2021. So what the boomers have done with foreign policy and national defense and fighting and then later prosecuting and fucking up the wars that their children were in and wasting their children's lives, thank you very fucking much. They did the same thing with the economy. The last normal recession that we endured, and that kind of resolved itself, was the dot-com bust of the early 2000s. That was a 3-year recession. It was not a very, it was a deep recession, but it wasn't a terrible recession. And then when the reset came, what was supposed to be a great economic reset came in 2008, largely due to the irresponsibility of the boomers that were in power, starting with the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act during the Clinton administration. I believe it was 92 or 93, maybe 94. It was before Newt Gingrich took control. Due to the Federal Housing Act of 1993. Thank you, Bill Clinton. Due boomers finding ways to go around banking restrictions and regulations with subprime loan packaging, credit default swaps, and all this other stuff that before Glass-Steagall was repealed was illegal. We were supposed to have a financial reset, the Great Reset, in 2008. Meaning all that stuff was supposed to dump out. All the institutions that were involved in that were supposed to fail. And then once everything was burnt down to the ground, we could rebuild again. If that were allowed to happen, if the government had not have stepped in and spent trillions of dollars bailing out these failed institutions who were run by boomers at the time and their childish idiocy and greed. Greed is good to a point until it becomes unethical, right? Not always illegal, unethical. For example, I'm greedy. I'd like to make as much money as I possibly can and secure for me and mine as much as we possibly can, so that way myself and my loved ones can have a decent life, and then maybe have some left over to either pass down or to share with my neighbors, or both. That's a good type of greed, right? And I want to compete in the marketplace with everybody else, and may the best man win. That's different than boomer greed. Mr. Lynch also referred to the fact, and I happen to agree with him on this, I actually made a whole video on this, that discusses the fact that the first 20 years or 30 years of their lives, depending on when they encountered Vietnam and all those protests and everything else, in their formative years, the boomers never really faced any trouble. Okay, yeah, there was the possibility of nuclear war with the Soviets, but even still, that was rather remote. We came close in 61 and 62 with the whole Cuba debacle, but that's as close as we came, and that was one time wasn't really, really close. But other than that, it was kind of the policy of mutually assured destruction, where the Soviets knew, and we knew, that if we attacked one another, we'd wipe out the world, so we just didn't do it. Okay? So even as crazy as that was, it wasn't imminent, except for 61 and 62. But for most of the boomers' upbringing, it was relatively safe. They lived in the most comfortable time in human history. Okay, yeah, they didn't have the internet, cell phones. Well, they did, but it was like a rich people thing, and the internet was used primarily by the government and banks and like Western Union, but that was primarily it. It wasn't a civilian use thing. So those things did exist back then. But as far as, like things at home, for example, if you don't believe me, go look up 1950s era refrigerators, home appliances. Some of that stuff, they had stuff that we don't have today, and it was actually pretty nice. And just like in the Merle Haggard song, a Ford and a Chevy would last 10 years. And those were comfortable cars. And those were comfortable homes. The Brady Bunch was made in the late 60s and early 70s. So, you could say with ease that those kids were part of the younger boomer generation, right? That was coming off of the 50s and 60s, and look at the house that those people lived in. Dad worked, Mom stayed at home, and they had a maid. So the boomers never knew, really, unless they went to Vietnam, the few that did, thank you. But I would say about 2/3 of that generation never really knew what trauma was. Gen X and the older millennials do. Because we endured something very much like what our greatest generation grandparents did. They endured Pearl Harbor. We endured 9/11. They went to war after Pearl Harbor. We went to war after 9/11. The leadership that the greatest generation served under in World War II was competent enough that they won that war. The boomer leadership that we were under after 9/11 just completely fucked everything up every chance they got. Oh, and they wonder why Gen X and older millennials are so fucked in the head. You know what's weird is when I was in the military, and I spent a lot of my time being primarily stationed in southeastern Arizona. And for a short while there, I was actually a member of a fraternal organization. No, it was not the Masons. It was another one, but still. And a lot of the seniors in that fraternal organization, because these people were still alive at the time, were World War II veterans. So I got to know a lot of World War II veterans that were still around that military town from the time that they served, and they just happened to retire there and build their lives there. Whatever, it is what it is. But I got to know a lot of these men, and I'll tell you what, these men were old ass men, but in my mind they were always badasses. But that aside, you didn't hear very much about PTSD or long-term mental health problems with these men. And for a while there, I always wondered why, because what they endured in that war was much more difficult and much more stressful, much more traumatizing than anybody's endured in any war since. The minor exception might be the Korean War, but that was pretty much the same generation in combination with the older portion of the silent generation. But we could kind of, for purposes of this discussion, we could kind of combine those two together because they were only 4.5 years apart. So the guys that served in World War II in Korea, you hear a little bit about mental health issues with Korea, but you hear almost nothing. I mean, I'm sure there was, but it was, about the follow-on effects, afterwards, right? And granted, these two conflicts were much more difficult than Vietnam and the one that I participated in, even though we lost both of those, but you can chalk that up to what it is. Maybe we didn't work hard enough, but anyways, but you don't hear them talking about the trauma that they went through. Well, those two generations also went through the Great Depression, but I knew a lot of these guys. A lot of them. And they weren't fucked in the head. And I just have to think that a large part of it was because when they spent their blood and their treasure, they were allowed to finish the job. They were led well. And therefore, everything that they suffered in their mind meant something and was worthwhile. So therefore, they could close that loop. And it was easier for them to put to rest everything that they suffered and make it make sense. So therefore, afterward, they had fewer mental health problems. Whereas in Vietnam, which we lost, and my conflict, which we lost, in Afghanistan and Iraq were the same conflict. Let's not lie to each other. All right? It was the same war. If anybody wants to pick up a map and look at it and see what they were going to attempt, you'll realize that it was a two-front war, and we were largely going after one target. But people don't think that far anymore. So just look at where Iraq and Afghanistan are on the map and look at what's in between, and you'll figure it out. Because we seem to be having a lot of problems with that particular country today now too. Right? But these boomers, they fuck everything up, so yes, c'est la vie, right? Fucking boomers couldn't lead their way out of a fucking wet paper bag. So with the economy, because they're so averse to and have never really suffered, really suffered. No, the 1970s don't count. And I will say this much, I promise you that a lot of the bullshit that we went through in the 1970s had a lot to do with the way that the boomers voted. And as a voting bloc demanded that our government do. And in losing that war in the 1970s, our country was a paper tiger as well. And that's why a lot of the fucked up shit happened in the 1970s the way it did. Right? But as Mr. Lynch likes to point out, in 1960, more than half of the population of the United States was under the age of 25. So by 1964, 1965, Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, more than 50% of the voting bloc. Well, I'll let you do the math. So these boomers have been in power ever since they were old enough to vote, starting in 1963. That goes with national defense policy, but also economic policy too. Because I promise you, if Goldwater would have won in 1964, which the boomers did not vote for, because he was too square. He was the guy that their parents liked. And fuck my parents. Right? That Goldwater would have won in 64, just like Reagan said in his speech, a time for choosing. That literally was the time for choosing. And we can pretty much assess everything that's happened since 1964 and track that since Barry Goldwater lost that election to today. But see, the boomers, it's not like they weren't warned. Because all the dystopian literature and movies that the Gen Xers and the older millennials like to refer to describe just how screwed up and how far down the shithole we've gone under boomer leadership was published either right before they were born or during their childhood while they were being educated. Example, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. That was published in the 1930s. About the goals and the end game of a socialist world state over the course of several years. George Orwell's 1984. As far as I know, it was published in the early 1940s, during or right after World War II. The description of the dystopia in some cases between him and Huxley is different, but there are a lot of similarities. We get the term memory hole from the book 1984. Aldous Huxley, in his book, forecasted drug use as a means of coping in his book, Brave New World. We have Fahrenheit 451, which came around in the 1960s, early 1960s. It was a British author, and primarily the first one was a British movie, not the fucked up one that was made later on. That one was changed greatly afterwards. Planet of the Apes, Charlton Heston. That book and movie came out in the 1960s. The boomers were teenagers then, so they were warned. They knew. The first movie about the book 1984 came out in the 50s. I'll bet you money some of these people watched that movie in a classroom in high school maybe, or went and saw it in a theater. Some of these boomers. So they knew. And what'd they do? They went headlong right into it. And now you can pick up those books or watch these movies and you'd be like, oh. And although we're not completely there, it's very scary how close we are. But let's go look up Soma in Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, and how it's used. And then let's look at antidepressants or legalized marijuana. Look at Winston Smith and his job at the Ministry of Truth in the book 1984, and how they would take stories that they published before, or articles or statements that they published before, but they wanted to change the narrative. So him as a writer in this ministry or in this office, he would find the story and then literally stick it in a memory hole, and it would be destroyed and then he would create a new story, and then they would go back through all of the publishing and the history and everything else and change it. And as far as they could do, or as far as they could reach, they would change all the publications. So if somebody would try to look it up, the old story, they'd never be able to find it. Does that happen today? Electronically? Yes, it does. Could that explain why you remember seeing a video on YouTube or reading a story somewhere? Maybe you Googled a story 6 or 7 months ago, and you know you read it, and you know what the story said, and then you get in a discussion, or you hear something, and you're like, wait a minute, that's either not true, or I remember this. So you go to look it up, and then you can't find it. And then now we start hearing, like Glenn Beck or content creators say, well, they try to memory hole that story. Or that discussion, or that article, or that speech, or whatever, right? That's straight out of 1984. George Orwell wrote that back in the 40s. He predicted it. And then you look at, like, you know, particularly in 1984, I'm more familiar with that. I'll have to go and reread Brave New World again. But particularly in 1984, there was Oceania, there was Eurasia and East Asia, right? And then you think about it, if you're somewhat geographically educated, right? And you think, all right, so Oceania, that would be like the British Commonwealth states, the United States, and Latin America. So what used to be an amalgamation of what used to be the old Spanish and the old British Empire, except for India and Pakistan. But like the other states, like Canada, the United States, Mexico, perhaps Australia and New Zealand, flies, window open, flies, you know, South America, maybe Brazil, maybe not. Maybe that's disputed territory, right? So that would be Oceania. And then Eurasia would probably be like the Central European states and Russia and the Arab states of the Middle East, and the Muslim states of the Middle East, and Northern Africa, perhaps. And then East Asia would probably be, maybe Eurasia also included India, I don't remember, but, and then in George Orwell's book, East Asia would be like China, Japan, the Koreas, the Philippines, because the Chinese probably conquered all of that. Maybe India, probably Southeast Asia, you know, like Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, places like that. So you could geographically, like, set these things up in your mind as far as how George Orwell was writing about them and how these powers in his book in 1984 were aligned, right? And then pull out a geopolitical map of today and see how close he is. It's almost like Aldous Huxley and George Orwell got in fucking time machines in the 1930s and 40s. And they weren't given a specific year, but they were sent forward like 70 or 80 years into the future. Or maybe even 100 years in the future, just a little beyond us. because we haven't reached all of those things that they write about. So let's say they went 100 years into the future from where they were at. So let's put them at like 2030 or 2040, right? When they jumped out of their time machine, but they weren't told, hey, it's the year 2040. They were just said, hey, this is in the future. And then they came back to the 1930s and 1940s and wrote about all of what they saw, right? It's almost like they did that. And it's almost like somewhere in the middle, like whoever wrote Planet of the Apes or Fahrenheit 451, they started out like halfway through the boomer's childhood, or maybe in the boomer, actually 1960s, so this would be like halfway through the boomer's adolescence. And they used that as a reference point and saw what the fuck was going on with how these people were starting to vote and protest, and the things that at the time in the 1960s and 70s, the largest voting bloc in the United States was, in fact, the boomers. They started to see which way things were going, and the things that these people, even though they were young people and not really in positions of power, but they had the voting bloc power, and they were already starting to drive policy by that. They're like, okay, well, if this continues, we're going to, because Fahrenheit 451 and Planet of the Apes, and actually Soylent Green, too. I forgot about that one. Those three were written in the 60s, and they said, okay, so we're going to get in our time machine from like 1964 or whatever, and we're going to go forward 100 years in our time machine. And then they went forward in their time machine 100 years, wrote about what they saw, made movies about it, and then came back and wrote it down. Or in case of Planet of the Apes, maybe 200 years after we fucked everything up and blew ourselves up, right? And then, so, it's just... And then I got introduced to these books in high school, not by a boomer teacher. I got introduced to all of these books in high school by two English teachers. One was a Gen X teacher. We all had a crush on her. She was an older Gen X teacher, but she was like, I don't know, we were in our teens, so she was in her early 20s. So she's an older Gen X lady, but she was still Gen X, right? So she introduced us to Brave New World and Soylent Green. And then the other English teacher I had, her name was Miss Mills. And she was an older woman. She was silent generation. Middle silent generation. She wasn't a boomer. She was silent generation. But she was kind of cool. She was tough, but she was cool. I'll never forget this woman. She was ugly as sin, but she was a cool lady, and she cared about our students, or about her students. And she introduced us to Fahrenheit 451. 1984, she had us reread Brave New World again, and then she introduced us to Planet of the Apes. So, an older Gen X lady who was probably taught by a World War II person taught us, or began to teach us these things, and then another teacher who was a middle of the group, silent generation person, taught us the rest of it. But none of our boomer teachers taught us any of that shit. And I had an econ teacher who was also a silent generation guy, and he was amazing. We had a textbook, but he only taught from the textbook sporadically. He did not teach us the Keynesian style economics that were popular, that boomer teachers liked to teach everybody at the time. He actually mentioned John Maynard Keynes, the history behind him, and then he dismissed him, and he said, okay, well, he taught us like Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, Austrian style and Chicago school type free market economics. and I aced his class. Fucking amazing teacher, Mr. Prentice. Love that guy. Silent generation guy. He was a short, balding Jewish man, smart as fuck, and he was cool too because, you know, in his class he would teach us the principles, but then he would have us do things like, you know, like go to the grocery store and do price comparisons, go to different grocery stores and learn about their different pricing schemes, and he would do things like how to generate business plans. He went over with us what Paul Volcker and Art Laffer did in the 80s and described that to us, and described to us, you know, basic supply side economics, all that stuff. He literally, when I started watching Milton Friedman videos on YouTube and Thomas Sowell's social discussions, which are also awesome, but Thomas Sowell's economic discussions, when he would go up there with Bill Buckley or debate Frances Fox Piven and kick her ass, it was like I was watching Mr. Prentice. And he was very hands-on with us, and he let us learn. I loved Mr. Prentice. Mr. Prentice was an awesome economics teacher. Older gentleman. My favorite social studies teacher was my 7th grade social studies teacher, Mr. Sabato. World War II guy. And my second favorite social studies teacher, actually Mr. Sabato was 6th grade. My second favorite social studies teacher was my New Mexico history teacher, Mrs. Rose. She was a World War II generation teacher. And she did a lot of stuff, like she took us to actual places in New Mexico. She taught us the actual history. So, like, we took a lot of field trips with her, but she was very hands-on. She taught us the real history. And she was actually the daughter of a homesteader, or actually, no, the granddaughter of a homesteader, the daughter of a rancher of a town that was actually an hour east of Albuquerque, on the other side of the mountains out on the plains. So she had a direct connection with a lot of the history. She actually knew a lot of the old families, the white families, the Hispanic families, the Native families, even the old black families. So we had a textbook, but we never really used it. She taught us the real stuff. My third favorite social studies teacher, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name, was my 11th grade Western Civ teacher. Once again, he was a World War II generation guy. He was a very old man. He was a cool old man. And he had the textbook, but he rarely used it. And we actually learned more from him. Once again, lots of museum trips, lots of lots of reading old books and stuff like that. So it was a difficult class, but it was an easy class because it was a fun class. All of them were. All of my best teachers were either Gen X, older Gen X, that were like just at the time just coming into teaching because they themselves were in their 20s, but they learned something from the World War II generation or the silent generation, or silent generation and World War II generation teachers. Okay? And then I look at and I remember Mr. Prentice, because this was when Bill Clinton was in office. And Mr. Prentice used to say, well, a lot of the officials today, this was in the 90s, want to return back to Keynesian economics. Whereas under Reagan, we were trying to trend back to, in the 1980s, we're trying to trend back more towards supply side. And Laffer, Milton Friedman, Austrian, and Chicago style economics. And he explained all that to us, right? So the reason why, and I want everybody to look up John Maynard Keynes, and actually Edward Bernays too. The reason why economically we're in the mess we're in is because once the boomers came into full power, and actually ever since they started voting in the 1960s, that Goldwater-Johnson election in 64 is where it all started to turn to shit. Fact, go look it up. Go listen to Reagan's 1964 Time for Choosing speech. And then think about what happened ever since then. On civil rights, on economy, on national defense, everything. Then go look at Aldous Huxley, and George Orwell, and Fahrenheit 451, and Soylent Green, the original Planet of the Apes. 1984, Brave New World. Go research people like Margaret Sanger, George Bernard Shaw, Edward Bernays, John Maynard Keynes, Milton Friedman, Art Laffer. We still have one of them alive today, Thomas Sowell. Walter E. Williams just recently passed away. Go study those people. Think about everybody who's Gen X, Millennial, or Zoomer. Think about who your teachers were and the age groups that they fell into when you were in school. If it has to do with economics or any type of social studies or history, and you had a boomer teacher, you pretty much need to throw everything that they told you in the trash. All of it. Also, a middle or younger millennial teacher, you probably want to hold them suspect too, as well as a few of your Gen X teachers. But especially boomer teachers. When it comes to economics or any type of history course, just trash it. And probably English and language arts too. Because they probably tried to fill you full of propaganda as opposed to learning the classics. Who studied Shakespeare in English? I did. I don't remember all of it, but I sure as hell did. Who studied Walt Whitman? Y'all picking up what I'm putting down? Who studied Henry David Thoreau? Who knows who Thaddeus Stevens is? Who knows the true lineage of both sides of his family of Abraham Lincoln? Who knows that Abraham Lincoln is biracial? Who knows that the Confederacy went from the Colorado River at the Arizona-California border all the way to the East Coast? Who knows that the 1881 battle at the OK Corral was literally a gang fight between Confederate or former Confederate and former Union factions? How many of you people know that? I could go on and on and on and on and on. about these things. Ad infinitum. So, back to my original question about, or my original concerns about people, because I work to the point sometimes to where I want to just fall out of my shoes. People who are surviving on less than me, and how, even just 15 years ago, that was enough to live like Homer Simpson, or better. Let's look at civil rights. They call Generation X for one reason only. Because starting in the 80s, Martin Luther King Day was established in 1981, by the way. But starting in the 80s, these boomers started pushing on us, Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King. By the time most of us, Generation X people, and a few of the older millennials reached middle school and high school, we started hearing about this guy named Malcolm X. And that he was not very good towards the beginning of his career, but towards the end, he turned out to be an American patriot. And he was actually a decent guy. Don't agree with his religion, but everything else, we started learning the truth about this man. And the next thing you know, starting in the late 80s, all the way up through the 90s. So this was Generation X people, and older millennial in high school, but primarily Generation X. White people, brown people, black people. The most famous t-shirt that we wore in high school and middle school in my generation, all of us wore, was the X t-shirt. Giant X. Roman numeral X. Because that was our little protest against the lie of Martin Luther King. Because all of us started to figure out, or at least, we started to figure out what was going on. And if there was a civil rights leader that we wanted to pay homage to, or a man that our generation wanted to pay homage to, it would be somebody like Malcolm X. Because that's who that shirt was created to memorialize. And it was created for black people to memorialize him originally, but all of a fucking sudden it became a trend and everybody wore it. Everybody wore it. I'll leave you with this thought. Solomon wrote in Proverbs, and I don't remember the exact chapter and verse, but he did write this. Under a wicked king or wicked leader, a nation groans. Under a righteous leader, a nation rejoices. The people rejoice. That's my thoughts for the day. This generation of wickedness named the baby boomers, which I like to call the rolling dumpster fire generation, needs to sit down. And I think President Trump, although he's a boomer, I think he sees this, and I think that's why everybody on his cabinet is either a Gen Xer, or on his potential cabinet, with the exception of RFK Jr., everybody else, with the exception of him, is a Gen Xer or an older millennial. They're old enough to remember President Reagan. All of them. And I told you last summer in a video I made last summer, I said, I bet you something like that's going to happen, and it did. So a vote for Trump is a vote for the truth, because I think he is setting us up to finally hand this stuff over and make these boomers sit the fuck down. This is AL-BINO signing out.